Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the FDP's webinar on Foreign Influence Management, Enhancing Security and Integrity of America's Research Enterprise. I am Lillian Andrews, your host for the meeting today, and I want to go over a few logistical notes before we get started. If you have any technical issues during today's webinar, please contact Zoom technical support at 1-888-799-9666 and select option 2. The audio for today's webinar will be streamed through your computer speakers. Submit any questions you have through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to everyone's questions, time permitting. Today's webinar is being recorded. That recording and the meeting slides will also be posted on our website after the meeting. I'm now happy to turn things over for the moderator for today's session, Pamela Webb.
Good morning. I'm Pamela Webb from the University of Minnesota, alongside with my esteemed colleague, Jim Luther from Duke University. We're your moderators today. Jim and I are just delighted that you could join us for the webinar today. As you can see, we just have this amazing panel of federal representatives to give us the latest news on what's happening with foreign influence management. Although I believe these people probably do not need any introduction to you, we're going to introduce them anyway in just a few minutes. Next slide. As you'll note in the session description for today's webinar, there's been a significant amount of change in the past few months as requirements related to foreign influence continue to be refined by both agencies and by grantees. Today's focus is going to be on what the agencies have accomplished in this space and are planning to do in the near future. In addition, we've used a tool called Thought Exchange to bring in your viewpoints and share those viewpoints, concerns, issues forward with our agency partners so they had the opportunity to be able to address these thoughts during today's panel. Jim's going to be sharing the results of that thought exchange here in just a minute. Next slide. So after you hear from us about the thought exchange, we'll hear first from Dr. Rebecca Kaiser, who will be presenting information. You can go forward, Lily, with the next slide. We'll be hearing first from Rebecca Kaiser, who's going to be presenting information about the shared work that's been happening across the agencies. And then we're going to augment that with agency-specific information from DoD, NIH, and NSF. We encourage you to ask questions during the webinar, and you can do that, as Lily said, by putting them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We're going to then harvest those questions and direct them to the panelists for the last minutes that we have together today. But first, let me go ahead and introduce our panel. Next slide. We are just really pleased to have with us today many of the speakers who have faithfully kept the FDP up to date on the latest developments in foreign influence over the past 2 years. Dr. Rebecca Kaiser, who has, as you may know, recently accepted a brand new role at NSF as Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy. And of course, no NSF panel is going to be complete without Gene Feldman as well. Talk about a power pair. And who better to hear from to cover key NIH developments than Michelle Bowles. Thanks, Michelle, for coming today. So we're also lucky to have not one, but 2 speakers from DoD. We have Dr. Bindu Nair from the DoD Office of Basic Research, and she's joined today by Barbara Orlando. They're going to give us an update on DoD-specific advances. In keeping with our goal for consistency, Jim Luther and Duke and I are back as your moderators. But for now, I want to turn us immediately into hearing about the results of the thought exchange that many of you participated in. Next slide. Jim?
Thanks, Pamela. By the way, Lily, I just got an email that it appears that some people are trying to log in and having a difficult time. It says it's full. Just a quick administrative point. Thanks, Pamela, and thanks again to the panelists, and thanks again to everybody joining us today. For those of you that had time to do this, in the registration, there was this thought. And if you've used the thought exchange ID in the past, the idea is that with this slide, we're asking you all for input into the discussions we're going to have today. Next slide. And again, this is a quick summary. There's about 112 people that responded with 79 thoughts. So this is a crowdsourced platform that enables you to put in different ideas. And you can see over on the right-hand side, there were 69 public institutions that were represented, 33 private institutions and so forth. And again, on the bottom left, you can see it was mostly administrators that responded, along with a handful of faculty administrators and technical staff. Next slide, please. So one of the neat things that Thought Exchange does is it creates this word cloud. And as you can see here, these are the topics that came up most frequently in the 79 thoughts that you all provided input on. The word size denotes frequency. So the bigger the word, the more often it was mentioned. And the color means they're related. So they were in similar thought if they're the same shade of color. So you can see some of the themes here. And we'll briefly talk about some of these as we transition to Rebecca and the rest of the speakers. Next slide, please. I won't go through these in detail, but as you saw in the word cloud, there's a handful of themes. Harmonization was a theme. We've talked about this in preparation with the panelists, and we've talked through the idea that harmonization is not sameness, right? It's having similar harmony and form and definitions and how we do things. It doesn't mean we're exactly the same. I'm sure those questions will come up today a little bit more. Definitions go hand in hand with that. Everybody is interested in how do we define in-kind? How do we define outside activity? What is consulting and so forth? And then the third major bullet was around the institutional role. And we've talked about this a lot with the panelists and with other federal representatives for the last 2 years. We are research universities. We are not detectives. We don't have police force that track these things down. So what is our responsibility when in many cases we're so dependent on the faculty to give us this information? And again, some of these regulations are kind of complex. And if they're not harmonized and not clearly defined, faculty with no intent whatsoever may or may not report something. And what do we do when we get that information? Next slide, please. The other two topics were COI. There's a lot of interest in how kind of conflict of interest interacts with this data points. And then specifically for NIH, because NIH recently put some information out in the last month talking about the templates, talking about the new documents and so forth. And I'm sure they'll come up as topics as well. Next slide, please. You've seen a version of this slide. I won't go through the details. I just wanted to highlight kind of where we are. And it's important to note, you know, it was 2 years ago and a week where many of us kind of really learned about this with Dr. Collins' letter. Now, we knew about it in the past. We read about it in the news. Some of us had different interactions with different agencies, but that letter was the shot over the bow. And then there was lots of input from DOD, from NSF, from all the agencies. And today, part of what we're waiting on is the continued central oversight or guidance from OSTP. Lots of coordination with all those. I would imagine that Rebecca will talk a bit about that. And I think the other thing I'd share on this is right underneath the top yellow line, I added kind of the phases that universities kind of went through, which to me were kind of like the 5 stages of grieving, right? The first one was awareness about the magnitude of this, but at that point, there wasn't a lot of public enforcement, so we really didn't completely get it. And then there's understanding and risk acknowledgement, more clarification, and now we're really getting into the agency implementation, which is great, very helpful. And now I'll turn it over to Pamela to initiate the transition to Dr. Kaiser.
Thanks, Jim. Next slide. I think you've probably seen this slide before, but we wanted to bring it back today because these are the areas that we are all keenly involved with as research administrators. And the ones in red are ones that we anticipate that our federal panelists are going to talk to us more about today, because it has a lot to do with the everyday lives of research administrators. But to start that, we're going to have Rebecca Kaiser talk to us about what the agencies have been collectively working on. Rebecca, next slide.
Great. Thank you, Pamela, very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you all today. And the timing is very relevant, of course. My position was just recently created, well, in March. And I recently, in fact, yesterday, met with our new NSF director, Dr. Panchanatham. And I told him about our meeting and our discussion here today with the FDP. Panch wanted, of course, for me to make sure to convey, number one, this issue of science and security is a top priority for NSF. And I know I could speak for the other science agencies that are part of this. It's a top priority for them as well. It goes hand in hand with making sure we protect the research enterprise and encourage collaboration. And I'm going to be talking about the difference between those things today. The second thing I talked to Panch about was the amazing interagency collaboration that we have. And that's another thing that I'm going to be addressing. And I'll tell you everything that I possibly can about where we are with the JCORE activities. Understanding that, of course, once things get to the White House, you know, we're the science agencies. And so that's a process that we have to kind of we don't know as much about, but I'll tell you as much as we can. And then lastly, what I talked to Panch about is the most important thing about my job is interface with the research community. It's important for us to hear from you, to work with you, to have conversations with you. And that's why the input that Jim just summarized is extremely valid. And I'll address as many of those points as I can. Next slide, please. So I wanted, of course, you know the Jason report Jim had on the slide as well. And we responded to the Jason report in January, and we're implementing many of the recommendations. But something that Kelvin Drogemeyer emphasized is the need for this robust, coordinated approach to strengthen the integrity and security of the U.S. research enterprise. So that big word harmonization that you had in the word cloud, we hear you. And we are coordinating and we're talking to each other every day. And I'll talk to you about some of the things that we're doing next. Next slide, please. So the JCORE, just to summarize, it's all about the research environment. And I like to talk about how the subcommittees that are part of JCORE really are interactive. They're interrelated. They're all part of the same system. So we talk about rigor and integrity in research. That is the responsible conduct of research. We talk about safe, inclusive, and equitable research settings. And that inclusivity is something that I think is absolutely vital, both to collaboration and to research security. We want to balance open research environments with security. And then, of course, we are very concerned. We understand about administrative burden. We don't want additional administrative burden when it's not necessary. And so the things that you'll hear from Michelle and Jean and Barbara are talking about the things that we put into place, always aware of the additional work that it does impose on you. Next slide, please. So the Subcommittee on Research Security, NIH, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense co-chair this with OSTP. I think one of the most vital things about the Research Security Subcommittee is the fact that it brings together the different parts of the research security policy making and enforcement and implementation parts of the federal government so that we can talk to each other. Many of us have not had a regular forum in which we can regularly interface with law enforcement and intelligence, for instance, and we're able to do that here. And I wanted to assure you that a big part of this has been the learning process for all of us of the perspective that the others have. So I think that many in law enforcement and intelligence have a much better understanding now of the grant making process and of the fact that we have certain roles in the government in giving grants. Universities have certain responsibilities, and how closely we work together and how that all works. So some of the things that we are working on as part of this subcommittee: we're developing guidance for departments and agencies. So I know that you've heard about this for a while. This is policy and guidance for federal departments and agencies in research security. It includes things like a consolidated definition of conflict of interest and conflict of commitment, and I can show you that on a further slide. It includes things like a definition of a foreign government talent recruitment program so that we have that consolidated definition all together. We are working as well on things like what research institutions are required to disclose in current and pending or other support, and why. So again, lots of harmonization. So as you can imagine, we as agencies are also very much looking forward to this document coming out. I can't tell you a lot more about timeline. I can tell you that it is actively in work and we're all participating in it. The next document is the best practices for universities and other research institutions. I am going to say that what this slide should say research organizations. Jean corrects me, and that it's a very important distinction. And again, this is going to be best practices and recommendations. This is not going to be requirements, but this is going to include a lot of the things that we've talked to you about already. Things like we recommend a risk assessment process for international collaborations. We recommend establishing a know your collaborator culture. This is, again, the definition of conflict of interest and conflict of commitment, and some other things that we recommend perhaps having more of a centralized system. For instance, coordinating between the Conflicts of Interest Office and the Sponsored Research Office within an organization to make sure that information is shared. So it's going to include things like that. Again, nothing that's required. And that is in process as well. So we are actively talking about it and providing input as we speak. But again, I wish I could give you more on timeline. I know we're all very anxious to have that out. You've seen the letter from the OSTP director, from Kelvin Drogemeyer, to the US research community. Of course, he presented to our own FDP as well. And that communication with the community is going to continue through JCOR and through the individual agencies. And we're also coordinating on education and outreach materials to highlight examples of risks to research, give you examples of some of the contracts. Our plan is to coordinate among the agencies and through JCOR and really put these training and education modules out on the website so that you don't have to invent things from scratch in this area of research security. NSF as an agency has already started that process of developing some of these things that will then coordinate with JCOR and the interagency. We are very anxious to start outreach as soon as possible. We will have phase 1 of this type of outreach on research security in coordination with the October 1st terms and conditions, the new terms and conditions with the PAP guide. And then we'll have additional phases of modules that will be coming out on the web. Okay, next slide, please. So CAR, the Coordinating Administrative Requirements Subcommittee, they're working closely with the Research Security Subcommittee. That's the bottom line. And again, they are worried about and concerned about administrative workload. Okay, so what they're going to be doing is they're going to be looking at this guidance to federal agencies in research security. as well as the guidelines, the recommended guidelines. And they are going to be helping to put together an implementation plan, particularly with the guidance to federal agencies, to make sure that we're harmonized and coordinated among federal agencies. Any new requirements are done with an eye of making sure that administrative burden is under control. So we have our own Gene Feldman and Michelle Bowles, who are active, in fact, very active parts of this subcommittee. So they are working on that, but I also want to assure you that the coordination both on administrative burden and requirements, as well as on research security, happens formally through the J-Corps, and it happens on a regular basis among agencies outside of the J-Corps process all the time. And I'll give you some examples of that. Next slide, please. So the definitions. A conflict of interest. And I wanted to show this because there's a difference between conflict of interest and conflict of commitment. And conflict of commitment, as you know, it's not a term that NSF as an agency has formally used. So we really look at this as a consolidated, coordinated definition that's a term of art. And the reason why I say that is because conflict of interest is very well ingrained, as you know, in federal policy and federal guidelines. And so they're different, okay? And something else that I wanted to emphasize is, as you know, research organizations have a very strong role in resolving conflicts of interest. Conflicts of commitment, I feel like research organizations certainly should emphasize the need to disclose to the research organization as well. Any other support, any other appointments, anything that might cause a conflict of interest, and look at those. But these are the kinds of things that we, NSF, and other agencies like NIH, et cetera, all look at. We look at these disclosures to look at capacity issues, the capacity of the researcher to perform the terms of the grant, as well as any overlap or duplication that might cause concern with what they're proposing to us as federal agencies. And so they're different things, both very, very important. Next slide, please. So some things that we're collaborating on. I think many of you have been contacted by MITRE. And this is part of a sprint that they are doing in foreign government influence, interference in the integrity of federally funded research. They call this a sprint because this is something that is rapid turnaround. They'd like the report to come out October, November. Many of the agencies that are part of J-Corps have been communicating and working with MITRE to provide input and thoughts. Jean and I were interviewed, for instance, by the MITRE folks. And what they're doing is they're interviewing many of us in the community, many of us in federal agencies and in law enforcement, putting together the themes of what they're finding and coming up with some recommendations of some courses of action that we might all think about taking in addition to what we're doing already regarding ways to address improper foreign government interference. So I think we're all looking forward to what they might have to say. You're all well aware of the National Defense Authorization Act and the requirement for national academies, science, technology, and security roundtables. We're all actively working with J-Corps to coordinate on those roundtables. And so I think more information should be coming out on that very soon. We were actively working on it. COVID hit, it got a little bit more challenging to figure out how to do really, really good roundtables virtually. And so we're going to get started on that again in the near future. And we all talk to Congress regularly. We share information with each other about how we communicate and what we communicate to Congress and what we hear. Now, I know that another thing that came through in the input is concern about some of the proposed legislation that might be out there on the table. We work with Congress to help provide technical assistance to them on things that that are doable, things that, on things like definitions of disclosure, things like definitions of current and pending support. And so there's a very active communication chain, I have to say. Where it stops for us, of course, is where we can't control what gets passed and what doesn't get passed. But I do want to assure everyone that we do communicate very regularly in the interest of making sure that we preserve the openness of the research system and protect what we need to protect. Okay, so I'm happy to answer any specific questions on that when we get to Q&A. Next slide, please. So again, we're working to standardize processes, and we do this through JCOR, and we do this among our agencies overall. So as an example, as you know, NSF has developed the current and pending support template for disclosure, and we developed it. We're actively talking to our NIH colleagues. We're sharing it with our DoD colleagues. And so this is something that I think we're all interested in harmonizing and coordinating. I know you have some specific questions for NIH on that, on the template, and I know Michelle will address that one during her presentation. Analytical tools. NIH, as you know, has developed a very interesting analytics capability. NSF is in the process of developing an analytics capability, and we're sharing information about what we find. Now, the overall goal of the analytics is to better understand what Jason said we needed to understand, which is the scale and the scope of what we're dealing with here. We don't yet know how many are out there who might not be disclosing that they're doing things that breach research integrity, that they might have another appointment that's not being disclosed, that they might have funding that significantly overlaps, or that they might be misusing federal funding due to obligations they might have to another entity. So those are the kinds of things that we want to understand more of, and we have some good analytics tools to help us do that, and we will be sharing the information with you. And again, something that we're talking about recently, and something that I think might be a really good conversation to have with you all, is defining research integrity. I know this is something in the Jason report. They said a lot of these issues we're talking about with conflicts of commitment might be under the rubric of research integrity. I think we need more conversation about getting a clear definition of what that is, especially if we're thinking about doing some training in research integrity. What are we training in? What are we talking about? And as you know, we've really evolved in the definition. We used to, I think, conflate research integrity with research misconduct issues. I think that we're talking about something different now, and I don't think they should be conflated, so I think we need to have that conversation. Next slide, please. So another input that we got is, what does the OIG do, the Inspector General, and what do the agencies do? So I wanted to point to the NSF example. At NSF, on the NSF, for the agency, we formulate the policy, and we carefully look at disclosures for capacity issues and duplication and overlap issues. If we see anything that might be a concern regarding waste, fraud, or abuse, or anything that may look like criminal behavior, we refer it to the Inspector General. So that's really where the line is, okay? And of course, if we see something that does raise concerns about capacity, duplication, or overlap, that's when we work with organizations. We work with awardees on those issues to either reassign the grant if we can't resolve the duplication or overlap or capacity issue, or take some other type of action, okay? The Inspector General is the investigative part of the house. I think the way they often have phrased it to me is the agency proactively looks at things, proactively addresses things from a policy perspective as well as from a communication perspective with our research organizations. The Inspector General is reactive. When information comes to them that might be concerning, they investigate it. They work closely with the Department of Justice if there are potential legal civil infractions. And they do provide recommendations once they do a thorough investigation on administrative actions to NSF, and it's the same with other agencies. And I'll talk about what some of those actions are. Next slide, please. So after we get a referral from the Inspector General because they found something of great concern, you can click on the bullets here, please. Thank you. And you can just keep clicking until we get all of them here. So the things that we have are, we sometimes get a recommendation to suspend the award, and often it's suspending the award while an investigation is ongoing by Department of Justice until they make some type of determination. Sometimes we get the recommendation to go ahead and terminate the award. And when we terminate the award, it's because it is just not proceeding according to the terms and conditions that have been set forth. In some of these cases, we work with the university to reassign the award to another principal investigator. In some cases, the award is just overall terminated. And then we often take action after recommendation to debar the researcher when there's significant concern. And we feel that for a certain period of time, they should not be eligible to receive additional federal funding or serve as a reviewer, a panelist, or a consultant on federal awards. Okay, and I want to say that all of these are not exclusive of potential civil and criminal actions that are pursued by Department of Justice. We've been doing, you know, there's been a lot of data out there. NIH has been really in front on this, and NSF, we are really ramping up. And I think that the reason why we're ramping up, it's not a negative thing. In some ways, it's a positive thing. Not a positive thing that there are issues there, but the fact is that the reason why we're finding more is because the information is being brought forward by research organizations to us, because we all want to address the issues that are at hand that are misuse of federal funding. And that way, we don't have to address the issues through any way of penalizing the vast majority of researchers out there who are playing by the rules, right? So if we can pinpoint and target just those that might be causing the issues here, I think that that helps us all. Next slide, please. So collaboration, right? Mutual benefit, that's collaboration. Leveraging complementary skills, facilities, sites, and resources, and exchange of personnel when there's this clear intellectual contribution, and we understand each other's organizational affiliations and sources of funding. I am concerned because I am hearing anecdotally about a lot of research organizations who are proactively ending all international collaborations, particularly with the countries of concern that Jim and Pamela mentioned on some of their slides. And I want to say that you know, I think we need to take much more of a risk-based approach. We need to ask ourselves these questions, establish a know your collaborator culture, but not take a sledgehammer, right, to all international collaboration. When there's mutual benefit and we know who our partner is, and we're clear that we understand and we're comfortable with where our partner's funding is coming from, then I think, you know, there is no reason not to enter into international collaborations. That benefits the scientific enterprise. That is not improper foreign government interference. That's a completely different thing from collaboration. Okay, next slide, please. So I just wanted to end again with the question of what is a foreign government talent recruitment program? First of all, I want to point everybody to some of the really interesting work that the Georgetown Center for for Strategic and Emerging Technology. I think that's the title. CSET, C-S-E-T. They are doing a lot of really interesting work, and they have translated some of the information that's only in Chinese into English, and you can find it on their website. One thing that I found interesting was the recruitment guide for Chinese talent recruitment programs that they have on their website. And this talks about that they look to recruit researchers in key areas that are part of the Chinese 5-year plan. They look to recruit those who would exhibit loyalty to the Chinese government. There are many other things like that in this translation. And so I think it was very helpful to me to better understand what was being sought through these talent recruitment programs. And I wanted to give you some terms of some things that are in the contracts to help understand. Now, part of the challenge that we have in this definition that we're going to be putting forward, it's a harmonized definition, but I do have to caveat that there are more than 220 such programs just from the Chinese government, and they are evolving and changing. So I think that this goes overall to the fact that, again, it is not banned from being part of a talent recruitment program to receive federal funding from NIH or from NSF. It does need to be disclosed, but we do also very much advise US research organizations to take a look and make sure that they know what their employees are doing and the obligations they're signing up to. Because they have things like this, that you have to publish this number of papers in top-level journals, right? Such as Nature Science, greater than 20. You're obligated to do this in the contract. And it has to be more produced than this other professor who's a competitor. And it has to be more the same or more than this other school that's a competitor to the Chinese university. That's something that I think is not really in the interest of science. It's in the interest of competition. And that does cause me concern. And again, this is from an NSF-funded researcher who's a full-time tenured professor at a US university. And next slide, please. And again, something else from a full-time professor at a US university. This is from his contract. It says that the first author and primary affiliation of the papers needs to be the Chinese university, okay? That you have to obtain overall research funding that equals or exceeds $1.4 million from outside of that Chinese university. That you have to develop a compound and achieve a number of patents, and the patents have to be Chinese patents. And that you have to recruit and hire those from these other talent programs, the National Outstanding Young Scientist Fund and the 1,000 Talent Program. So I think that goes against open competition for sure. The patents, again, you know, attributing a patent to another government, another country when you're at a US university. And the affiliation of the papers has to be that Chinese university, all concerning. So as you can see, this is why we do recommend taking a close look at these things, and we also are concerned. Okay, I think that's my last slide. We can go to the next. All right, thank you all very much. And I know my agency colleagues will give much more specifics than I did.
Thanks, everyone. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think you all know I'm Jean Feldman. I'm head of the policy office in the Division of Institution and Award Support. I am, if you could just present all these bullets. I am just giving to you as part of this opening of my presentation the science and security goals that NSF has been using for many, many months now and have been wonderfully presented by my colleague, Rebecca Kaiser, as the goals of our what we're trying to achieve here. And I think that the status of these science and security goals remain as valid today as when they were first presented. And that really gets to the importance of collaborations globally and domestically, the absolute importance and transparency of the process and the open environment, and the need to balance that open environment with the needs of security, the concepts of understanding the risks and mitigating the risks, and then sharing that knowledge and best practices. And I think that you've been seeing that is really what we have been doing over these past many, many months at NSF. And so what I've attempted to do in this presentation in a very short 10 minutes is to give you what we have done, a consolidated presentation. And so if we can move to the next slide, please, we can talk about what NSF has done over these past many months to work this issue. And it has been a very, very collaborative process that we've had with you. So if you could click the bullets on this slide, please. Yes, all at once, that would be great. And I'm really excited to be able to tell you that many of these are new bullets, because we really have continued to work this issue hard at NSF from a variety of different perspectives. And as Rebecca has already announced, she has this fabulous new position, the Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy. No good deed goes unpunished at NSF, because she also gets to be, at the same time, the head of our International Science and Engineering Office at NSF. And I think she's already emphasized, however, the importance to this issue to Dr. Panchanathan, and she provided his well wishes on that topic as well. In addition to that, we have spent a lot of time trying to improve the disclosure of the transparency of the information, as well as what we're interested in receiving. And so I'm going to talk about that in the way of PAP guide disclosure clarifications that we have been working on over many months. We also have revised the term and condition on international collaborations for our major facilities. We have talked about what it is that we're doing and how we're doing that, and what our expectations are should you have a new collaboration with an international partner, and what the requirements would be if you should do that. We also have a brand new disclosure requirement, a new term and condition that NSF has issued that talks about what happens if you identify a post-award issue of a faculty member who had, at the time they submitted a proposal, they had a disclosure, they didn't provide it. Guess what? You found out about it. And so we have worked with not only what information we have require you to provide, but also the system and what kinds of, what you actually have to provide to us. That new disclosure requirement will go into effect for all new awards and funding amendments on existing awards on or after October 5th, 2020. We also are in the process of rolling out a new project reporting format. This is the way we will get updated information from PIs and co-PIs on any new other support or current support, as NSF refers to it. And that is also something that we intend to roll out to faculty for reports submitted on or after October 5th. Next slide, please. Now, I definitely also, this is some of the other things that we have been working on, the Jason report, et cetera, the kinds of things that we have been working on with the scientific community, as well as with our international, with our government partners. what I'd like to focus on now, if you go to the next slide, are some of the clarifications that we've made that we hope will be useful to you. We have now clarified, and this is a recent clarification that came out in FAQs and on our page for the bio sketch. We've had indicated for a long time that your appointments had to include, and this came out in the PAP guide, any titled academic, professional, or institutional positions, whether or not remuneration or payment is received. But we clarified it because we understood that folks didn't know what professional meant. And so we recently put out new guidance to say, and so see, we really do listen to what you're saying to us. We don't know what it means, Jean, and so we've clarified it. Senior personnel must identify all current domestic or foreign professional appointments that is outside of their academic, professional, or institutional appointments at the proposing organization. Meaning, if it's something you're working at your institution, IACUC, you work on the IR, we don't need to know that. That is not considered what we believe to be a professional appointment. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the clarifications we have made around current and pending support. Current and pending support, obviously, we have focused on the fact that we use this to assess the capacity of an individual to carry out the research as well as any potential overlap and duplication. This is about, and I saw this on the first slide when you talked about what the people were concerned about. They're concerned about this, but unfortunately, we gotta know it all. Because if we don't know they're outside, whether it was directly to them or to their proposing organization, how can we assess whether there's overlap, duplication, or whether they can carry out? So that's one of those discounts that we have. Project or in-kind contributions without a time commitment aren't required to be reported. Why? Because if they don't have a time commitment, we don't need to assess the capacity issue. Next slide, please. In-kind contributions that are intended for use on this project. Yes, we learned that from you when we sent our very first draft out for public comment. No, though you were right, those go in facilities, equipment, and other resources, because if they're going to be used on this project, a reviewer needs to be able to assess whether they have the capacity to do that or not, and whether they have all the facilities, equipment they need or not. And that is why it would go in facilities, equipment, and other resources. The single biggest disconnect, bar none, is the second bullet. If it's in current and pending support, it's different than what you're doing on the budget. That's how much money you're asking for NSF. That may not be what time you're spending on the project at all. That's why we need for you to provide on current and pending support different than what you put on that budget. And so that is really, really important. Next slide, please. We've been asked a lot of questions. We've got this format out there. We're telling people to use it, and it asks you to report on 5 years. And guess what? We have a lot of very fabulous faculty members who they get support for more than 5 months. Well, good for them. What we're telling you to do in those situations is to report on the next 5 years. If you've got a project that spans 2 fiscal years, you should report on the latter of those 2 fiscal years. We're not requiring you to report at all on startup packages if they're from your proposing organization. We do not consider faculty salary, current and pending support. So I'm going through all of these bullets because they're all of what we've learned. Next slide, please. Mentoring activities. We've got a lot about my institution is supporting me to do a lot. It's basically part of my appointment. That's what I have to do. Those kinds of mentoring activities that are part of your regular appointment do not need to be reported. However, if you are getting outside funding or funding from an external organization to help pay for that mentoring, then we would want to know about that. We've also had a lot of questions about research endeavors. And the individual says, I have got a postdoc in my lab. I don't get any money to support them. They have funding from somewhere else to do that research endeavor. Do I have to include the postdoc on current pending support? The answer is no. Research endeavors refers to the endeavors of that particular individual. And I will not call this next bullet the Jim Luther bullet because I got in trouble for that. So we'll just call it what it is, the consulting bullet. So consulting or professional services, if what you're really doing is really what's in 20459, that is, and Jim's laughing, that is a professional service. That to us is not really an example of what is a real source of support that you'd want to include in current pending support. However, if the individual is doing research as part of that consulting, then they do have to include that. So again, what I've intended to do in this presentation is pull everything together for you, all we've learned. And so I'm hoping that I can take your questions at the end. Next slide, please. And now I get to turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Bowles from the National Institutes of Health. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for that helpful information. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So I don't necessarily need to go through the background. I think Rebecca and Jean did an outstanding job talking to you all about what the need is for commitment, transparency, and security. And what we want to do is highlight some of the changes that NIH is making and highlight for you how we have collaborated very closely with NSF and our other federal research partners. So next slide. So NIH took an approach based on the feedback that we've received from many venues, from our FDP family, from our Koger family, ARI, and others. And the approach that we took was to analyze the existing policies and the application instructions and all of those pieces of the guidance that hit upon the J-Corps report. And we recognize that and have been openly supportive of our research institutions or organizations, as Rebecca said, organizations, with the need for us to continue to clarify our existing policies on other support, align other support with other support, highlight what we would like to see in our bio sketch, and provide the details on in-kind contributions such as gifts and the purpose of the bio sketch. We also took a very hard look and did a cross analysis of our policies, excuse me, our policies and our application instructions and our forms. And when we looked at that, we saw the mismatch of various information that our colleagues, FDP, Koger, and other research organizations highlighted for us. So we took a pause and stopped to look at the data format collections and decided that we probably needed to align those with the instructions, and then we needed to align the instructions with the policies. And we worked very closely with our colleagues at NSF to do that in an effort to harmonize, reduce confusion, reduce applicant and recipient burden. So the next slide, please. So looking ahead, what you will see from NIH is we modified our NIH grants policy statement last year in December of 2019, or I believe it was December 2019. And we decided that we would go ahead and look at the other support because we felt like we were very clear in our policy description. We looked at the other support format and application instructions, and we harmonized everything. What we did was we updated several sections that I'd like to just kind of talk you through just a little bit. We updated the sections of Section B to capture all of our scientific appointments within the BioSketch. We wanted to make sure that we kind of aligned with NSF in that model. Of course, you know, we won't be using Science CV, but we will be capturing that in our form, in our format, and our instructions. We also heard a lot of confusion regarding Section D related to research support, which duplicates a lot of the information that was shared in our other support. I can't help but to tell the story about when Gene Feldman came to the NSF, and we were sitting down going through some of these things, and we're kind of comparing and contrasting with what are you looking for this research report that's so different? And Gene said, I'm just flat out confused. And if I'm confused, then I'm sure Jim Luther and others are too. So we don't want the Jim Luther to be confused about that, because Jim will push us to that point of to the lowest common denominator. What does that mean? So I said, Gene, I think you're right. We removed the research support from the BioSketch and put it in other support so that it aligns. So we feel that's a really good feature, added feature. Next slide, please. Within our other support, we looked at the policy language that was clarified, like I said, in the grants policy statement. And what we tried to do was clarify the definitions, many of the definitions: current and pending support, gifts, what's a gift, what's not, professional services, consultants, and we did do a similar model of NSF, which we pointed back to the Title II OMB cost principles, because we don't need to redefine what's already been defined by the OMB, that we don't have that luxury. We also outlined our expectations for reporting in-kind resources, and we did align ourselves very much with the NSF as well. Next slide, please. We looked at the other support format page, and highlighted the fact that we needed to update our format to include some of those pieces that we are asking for. We knew that, you know, in-kind contributions was not going to nicely fit in another support page if we did not highlight for you guys where we wanted to capture it. We also did a new format page and detailed instructions on what we mean when we're asking for the in-kind contributions. We tried to capture also current and pending other support in the other support section. We really looked at how the just-in-time model, because NIH does use the just-in-time model, but we still didn't want to give an opportunity for our recipients or applicants not to place in the pending, which is a requirement at the time of the award or at the time of just-in-time. We will be revisiting whether or not some of that pending support has been finalized and actualized, but we wanted to make sure that we gave that model and gave those sections some due diligence in looking at how we wanted it to be reported, aligning it in the format that it needed to be, and coupling things in buckets that made sense for you and for us. I will say also, the NSF received a lot of great feedback from our applicants and our recipients. And you know, why duplicate efforts? We really looked at a lot of the concerns and the questions that our recipients asked the NSF, and we thought, why go back out and ask the same questions? We can take the information that you provided to NSF along with the questions and concerns that you had with our existing model and perfect that for you. Next slide. I do want to highlight the fact that we are having our fall virtual seminar program funding on grants administration, where we will be providing the final details and look and see of our format, the format of our other support, BioSketch, and all of the changes that we are making. We are giving that session a lot of tender love and care to make sure that you guys have the questions and the visuals and the answers that you are looking forward to. We are still within the enterprise finalizing and completing our approval stages, but we do hope to have out the changes by November of 2020, and we're looking forward to doing that as we are making updates to the policy statement for some of the Title II changes that we will need to do. So what we wanted not to do was put out something and then have to turn around, clean it up, and repackage it for you. But we will have a session at our regional seminar devoted to the other support and the commitment transparency piece. So we're looking forward to sharing that information and unveiling the changes that we believe will help make all of the transparency and overcommitment and support and protect the research enterprise helpful to you. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues in DOD.
Hi, good morning, everybody, or I guess it is afternoon. Sorry about that. This is Barbara Orlando. I am the Grants Policy Manager at DOD, and as such, am in charge of taking all the goals that we put through J-Corps and how are we going to implement them into our research community that we're working on. DOD recognizes the significant impact that our research institutions, whether it's at the university, a nonprofit organization, state or local laboratories, however research is conducted for us, that have had in advancing our national security goals and protecting the lives and welfare of our citizens. We also recognize that the contribution of the fundamental research integrity principles, such as open and free exchange of ideas across the international community. And yet right now we are faced with the challenges that have been discussed all day long at this seminar around how do we continue our research efforts and apply these various research integrity principles while reducing the risk of the foreign government's exploitation that are intentionally targeting the U.S. and our allied partners' research and intellectual property. As Rebecca has discussed, this protection of our research enterprise is a national priority. As has been stated from time to time, these goals can't be accomplished just by one agency, one person, one program, or just the federal government. It's going to take the entire research community to meet the challenges and mitigate the risk to our research efforts. As such, DOD is committed to the support the J-Corps efforts and has representation on each of the working groups that Rebecca had discussed in her presentation. DOD initiated an interagency team that's looking into how we can implement the various different federal efforts as they come in to ensure the integrity of our research while providing the adequate stewardship of our federal funds. First and foremost, we want to protect our federal taxpayers. We do this through coordinating outreach and engagements. We are working with J-Corps and our other partners that engage the non-federal research community through meetings like this one we're doing here with other agencies and organizations as we talk, and they represent the different parts of the research community, not just those that administer the research awards, but also those groups that have programmatic ideas and moving forward with the different program strategies. We also are engaging with our international research partners and allies to identify those common issues and common concerns that we have when we face regarding that improper foreign influence. They're having many of the same challenges that we in the U.S. are having at this time. We have engaged with various national organizations to identify some of the best practices that we can follow to take to reduce that influence of the foreign government exploitation. I'll get this all out. This effort has included supporting the studies and roundtable discussions that are being conducted through MITRE and the national academies. But more importantly, is that less formal one-on-one or small group discussions that our staff conducts with the individuals who conduct the research. They're listening to the concerns of those individuals and who have the best to reduce this influence that they're getting pressured on. We've encouraged open discussions at different scientific meetings by actually conducting panels that are focused on tell us what we're doing, as opposed to always be, this is what we're going to do, now you follow what we tell you to do that. We will continue those efforts as this enterprise moves forward. Just as our other colleagues were describing and in their presentations, DoD has reviewed our practices, and we have looked to standardize and clarify our disclosure requirements for the participation in our DoD-funded research. The information will be used to support protection and intellectual property, controlled information, key personnel and time and commitment, just as the others were, whether it's a conflict of interest might be there or not, as well as information on critical technologies that are relevant to our national security. As part of that, of the proposal process, we do require that the key personnel, as identified in the proposal, report on their paid and unpaid current activities and those pending activities that they have applied to work on. Not only the support that's made to the institution, but also that any support that's directly given to the individual needs to be reported for that. We are also going to require that the same information be included in any prior approval packages that come in for the replacement of the key personnel as required by 2 CFR 200. It is clear that we need to continue to collect information and evaluate this information throughout the period of performance of an award. Therefore, we are now going to start collecting the data that's found in the RPPR section, participants and other collaborating organizations. This part not only includes a listing of the people who have worked on this research project, as well as what they've done, their role, et cetera, for doing that, but it's also collaborations that you've had with other organizations that you've been working on. It's also the sections in here is where we would request that the key personnel would identify any changes and update the current and pending information that had been submitted as part of the proposal process. Lastly, one of the pieces that we're beginning to require for implementing some of these strategies is that we're going to start requesting that each grantee submit a data management plan, and as part of the proposal process, that provides the information on how the data is stored, how it will be accessed, how you will be protected, especially if the data is containing any PII information, how this is all accomplished within your research institution. All of these combined things will give us a way to help us develop the risk assessment as to what risk would be posed by making an award. And then we would work with the proposals and the organizations to how to best mitigate those risk concerns. We fully appreciate that some of the efforts may be considered burdensome, and that DoD is working with the overall community to identify ways to help ease that burden while we continue to do our due diligence to identify and reduce the risk of exploitation. As we collaborate with our other federal agencies and research institutions, we have to acknowledge that as much as we try to establish common practices, definitions, reporting requirements, we still have to do all of this between the laws that govern our agency, which are different than some of the laws that govern the other agencies, the different authorities we operate under, the regulations, and the mission of each of our federal awarding agencies. But we have to weigh all of our efforts when we make them. DoD is committed to looking at how that affects the actions that we put in might have on our non-federal partners in regards to your time, the cost, the effort. How would this proposed rule or requirement affect not just the large research institutions, but our smaller schools that are working to establish a research department? How will any requirements we impose reduce the capacity of persons' ability to apply or wanting to apply, such as our new researchers? How do we keep the research enterprise moving forward while we're still working on doing this? As we work with the other agencies to implement any of the activities that come out of the J-Corps identifies as common goals for all of us, we will coordinate with the public as we go through any of our rulemaking requirements. So please note, DoD is open and wants information and wants you to help provide us with ways that we can move forward to make this protection work for all of us, and so that we can have a wonderful forward-going research community in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
And I will turn. Yeah.
Go ahead. So I think
no,
we're going to.
I'm sorry. I was going to say I'll put it back over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Barbara. So I think we'll go ahead then with Q&A. We have about 15 minutes to do that. We will try to get through all the questions that people have asked. But if you don't hear your question, just know that it's because we have a wealth of opportunity here. So let me start with the first question that came in. We had someone write in and indicate that talent recruitment guidance is really the is the single largest concern that they have right now. And Rebecca, it was just great to hear that there is going to be a definition for a foreign talent program forthcoming. Do you have any idea about when that might be available, even in draft? And I think the reason that we're asking that is that many of us, if we change our administrative systems, especially our electronic systems, where we're asking our faculty this kind of question, we often have like one chance to get it done with our IT people, or we have to go back in queue. And so I think there's a lot of interest in being able to give really good and clear and useful information to them.
Sure. And Pamela, thank you very much for the question from our colleague. We're not sure when the document is going to come out, but I can tell you that the definition of a foreign talent recruitment program will be very similar to the existing definition that NSF has and that Department of Energy has. And just to make sure that everybody has that on hand, we're happy to provide that and make sure that it's available to everybody. It's an overview, right? It's an overview definition of to help people understand, I think, the difference between something like a von Humboldt Foundation fellowship, which is not a foreign talent recruitment program, and these types of things that we are talking about, which are more concerning to us.
Right. And I believe along that same line, we've heard in the past that there are some foreign talent recruitment programs that are perfectly fine, that are really no different than us competing for the best faculty across US domestic institutions. So will the definition be clear enough that we'll be able to differentiate between those legitimate recruitment tools, if you will, and these ones that are clearly inappropriate with the kind of terms that you described?
Yes, I think it will be quite clear. I do have to say that for all funding agencies right now, being part of even one of these things that's a foreign government talent recruitment program by the definition is still allowable. It just needs to be disclosed. And we will look at the information from a capacity and overlap and duplication perspective. However, the reason why I raised this in particular as different, and I think the guidance will also say this, as different from the other programs, is these foreign government talent recruitment programs often have the types of terms that I had in my presentation. And so we really do encourage U.S. organizations to look at the terms that their faculty members might be signing up to as part of these talent recruitment programs. I have to say another concern that we found is that often I think the faculty member is told that the terms in the contract that they really won't apply in reality. Don't worry about it. Sign this because this is a standard contract, and then you know how that goes. It often ends up not to be the case. So I think again this is something that we as clear as we can be is the most important, as you said, in our definition, but also how we use the information when it is disclosed to us.
Pamela, could I jump in and do a follow-up on that?
Add to that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Bindu, if you could give the DoD perspective, because I think you did so in the January meeting. We discussed about this.
Yeah, I fully support what Rebecca's saying. But I want to be clear about the difference between disclosure and action, right? And I think that is one of those things that, so when you see the definition that we've come together as an interagency and come up with a definition of what a foreign talent program might look like, how you are going to be able to use that in your internally in each of your organizations, I think is not going to be perhaps as clear as you might like, because what we're talking about is disclose these things to us, right? Disclose things that may be foreign talent programs or that may fall into this a little bit broader category of foreign talent programs. The question of whether that is going to be a problem for a specific funding opportunity is going to be made by yourself as part of your disclosure process and your disclosure policies in your university that we'll be talking about in this document that Rebecca is talking about as best practices documents, as well as on the other side of it, what we in the departments, in the agencies that are making these choices may ask for and may push on. So it isn't a checkmark activity. And I think that's the key thing that I'd like to get across. What we're asking is to strengthen, we want to give you the information so that you understand what the terms are that are concerning to us. We believe that you ought to know what those are for yourselves to manage your own internal processes and programs. On the other hand, we also hold, we are asking for disclosure of all of those things. And how we make those choices and selections, we're going to be as transparent as we can about that, but it isn't a one size fits all discussion. Because as Rebecca mentioned, right now, it is not actually disallowed, but we might be asking a heck of a lot of questions, right? If somebody comes to us with one of these concerning programs.
I think that's a great point, and I think it maybe brings up a broader question that also has come forward, and that is when harmonized definitions or harmonized agency guidance is completed through the process that's been working now, what agencies are expected to be a part of that? I mean, we certainly already know that NIH and NSF will. We know that DoD has been actively engaged. But can you say more about that? And that helps us frame it, of course, internally for how we will then in turn use those definitions.
Right. And this, again, this is, part of the reason this isn't out yet is not because we don't want it to be out, but because how we get it out defines who is impacted by it, right? So we can all of the agencies that are sort of participating in the JCAR process can today go off and say, hey, we're going to adopt this, right? And adopt it on a sort of federated, like kind of approach. The reason to try to see whether or not we can get something from the federal government out would mean that all of us would be bound to those, those basic definitions. And I think hearing from all of you, that is what you want, right? You want harmonization. I mean, we saw that in the word cloud. So harmonization and federal agencies, as you know, is not a simple process. It is not it's not a turnkey thing. To get to agreement takes a while. I believe that we have, to the 99th percentile, gotten to agreement among the sort of impacted parties in the federal agencies, but now we have to go through the process of turning it into a federal-wide policy, and that is there are many more ghosts to slay on that process, and that's where we are right now.
Okay. Thank
Bindu,
you.
could I follow on that? It's great to hear that. And it was also great to see Michelle nodding her head a lot when Jean was presenting the details. I don't know if we're reading the tea leaves as to what will come out in the fall, but we're hopeful. But I wanted to kind of segue this discussion into the role of the university, right? So, we kind of want our cake and eat it too. We want a detailed list that we can say they're okay or they're not okay. But we also, Bindu, to your point in January, you were very clear in your presentation that creating a list is complicated because an institution that might not be appropriate for drone research and high-tech public national security research might be entirely appropriate if we're studying algae or something. And so, when you all contemplate how to roll this out, and one more caveat, Rebecca, it was so wonderful to hear you comment that you need to make it work for all faculty and all institutions, right? I mean, we're looking at burden, we're looking at the breadth of public, private, big, small, and so forth. But I would imagine how we're going to operationalize this is in the forefront of your minds.
Yeah, I think I speak for my colleagues on JCOR to say that remember, policy is fairly broad-based. The devil, as always, is in the details, and the details of the implementation. And we are not proposing to do anything different than we've always done, which is say, okay, we've got our marching orders as to what the federal government wants to do. Here it is. How do we do this? And what are the pushbacks from you on how to do that? And what are the, what are the comms plans associated with it? How do we get your feedback on things that we think are going to be easy but are going to be really hard? The difference, if there is one, is that we're going to try to do some of this in a coordinated manner rather than an individual agency manner. But that doesn't mean that the individual agency activities are not going to happen, because again, as Barbara pointed out, we all have different missions, we have different rules that we have to follow. So at some point, the harmonization is going to stop and we're going to have to go individual. But we will try to do some part of this coordination with you, perhaps using FDP as a vehicle. Once that guidance comes out, we are going to do exactly what we've done in the past, which is come back and talk to the community about, here's what we propose, what do you think, what have we missed, and how do we turn on that. And then when we get to the point where we have a sort of top level federal plan, then it's going to be up to the agencies to go back and continue to do what they do, which is, okay, for the specifics of our agency, how are we going to make this work? So that is the plan. The plan is not to roll out something that you can't do, but to work with you to figure out how do we, now that we have the sort of top level guidance from the federal government about what it is our grants need to be able to do, how do we do it?
That's wonderful. That's great.
Okay. Sorry, Joe. We have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one more question and then give Jim the last question for the wording. We had a question come in about, this really has to do with institutional due diligence and agency expectations for institutional due diligence. The specific question is, when an institution certifies information on a biosketch, and a PI co-PI discloses outside employment, domestic, foreign, do you expect as sponsors that the institution has actually seen and validated a copy of that outside employment contract? Or would it be sufficient to rely on information that a PI or co-PI has submitted as part of institutional processes and certified as accurate?
Well, Pamela, it's funny that the question comes up because we just had this conversation in NSF and with colleagues, because right now, of course, we are not going to tell organizations how to do their job, right? I think that's the main thing. So when a university certifies that the information is correct, we expect them to go through the due diligence process that they feel is necessary to do. That being said, we do, because of a lot of these things that researchers are signing, may well be concerning. We think it's a good idea, if it's possible to take a look at the contract, but that's not a requirement. We're going to leave it up to the university. If there is an issue down the road, like I said, with information that's disclosed, we first of all advise the university to verify in any way they can. Again, like Jim was saying, we are very aware of the differences in size and resources of different institutions and their capabilities to be able to go and do widespread verification. But if there are questions down the line or information is found out through a process, that's why we really are providing this additional term and condition on what to do with that additional information. So I don't know if that's if that completely answers the question, but I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you, Rebecca.
So
great.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll direct this to Michelle, but all can jump in, because Michelle, you still there, Michelle? I don't see your picture.
Oh, I'm sorry. You don't see me?
No, I'm joking. No.
I was going to jump in and just add to Rebecca's response, if that's okay, for the NIH. So I do want to say that, as we know, the information that comes, we have a relationship with the institutions, with the organization. The information that comes in from the organization needs to be signed by the AOR. So if the AOR is not aware or does not have the information to confirm that the appointments are in fact in place, NIH would have concerns with that. NIH is in the process of making decisions of whether we would want to have copies of such appointments. We are very serious about making sure that the transparency is first and foremost. And a lot of what we heard, and I know that Dr. Lauer and Dr. Black have heard this in their travels, and OPRA, Office of Policy for External Research Administration, has heard it in discussions with our recipient colleagues, is that many of the AORs, well, we didn't know, there was no knowledge of it. And so we really would like to place that responsibility right at the institution, because the institution has to have that relationship and that discussion with these PIs. And so you might not be surprised if NIH asks for copies of these contracts and having them translated if they are in fact in another language. So that those are the decisions that we are making. We do not believe that, you know, it is something that we should just take from the principal investigators. We've seen over and over and over again that that doesn't work. So I just wanted to jump in there and add that piece for the NIH, please.
So I'll close with a statement instead of a question because we're out of time. One observation, and Rebecca, you mentioned that research integrity and integrity of research are different things, and they shouldn't be perceived in the lens of research misconduct. That's great to hear, right? Just as we work through this. The last thing I'd say is, as the new guidance comes out, and Michelle, it sounds like you're talking about some stuff that's coming out in the next couple of months. You know, universities are very eager to make sure that the enforcement is aligned with the clarity and so forth. So, because as Pamela opened up with, we have training and monitoring and technical systems that we have to upgrade and so forth. So obviously there's a glide path that we always ask for some understanding in that space. And I think the last thing I'd say before I turn it over to Lily, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
No, I agree with you absolutely. That's something that I'm very sensitive to, and that the leadership at NIH is very sensitive to. We do realize that a lot of your processes are automated, so you know there will be that time where we say this is the requirement, and then that implementation period will kick in sometime after. But we want to make sure that we have everything we need in the full spirit of disclosure and transparency, and above all, integrity.
That's great. And we'd like to ask you all to come back. You know, I think this is your 4th or 5th or 6th time. It's a great panel. Everybody appreciates it. So thanks for your time. And when more information comes out, we'll surely invite you back, and hopefully you'll be available. Lily?
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It looks like that's all the time we have today. And a big thank you to our speakers for the session today. And a big thank you to all of you who had difficulty logging in and stuck with us. We appreciate your patience with us while we fixed the problem. As a quick reminder, the meeting recording and the slides will be posted on our website shortly. Thank you all for participating, and have a good day.
Thank you.